Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. In today's video, I am going to be making the nut for my 6-string multi-scale fan fret guitar. And I'm going to be using bone to make the nut. Now, I like to use bone because it's inexpensive, readily available, and it's a proven technology. There are other types of materials that you can use to make a nut. For example, brass is popular, graphite, corian, and I've even seen a Stratocaster style prefab nut made out of titanium. So there are all different sorts of materials that you can use, but I always go back to bone because, like I said, it's inexpensive, it's readily available, and if you make it properly, it will last for years and years and years, and it will perform flawlessly. Now, occasionally I will use graphite. For example, if I'm going to be building a guitar with either a Stratocaster style tremolo or a Bigsby, I will oftentimes use graphite because it helps the guitar stay in tune as you're using the whammy bar, so to speak. There's no binding, and the strings are lubricated as they pass through the slot in the nut. Now, that's not to say you can't accomplish similar performance with a bone nut, but you'll oftentimes see guys scraping off pencil lead, which is graphite, and depositing those shavings into the slots on the nut to help lubricate the strings as they pass through the nut. Graphite can also be a choice if the person who's going to play the guitar likes to do a lot of string bending. Because again, the strings won't bind up at the nut, and the guitar will probably stay in tune better. But for this build, I'm going to be using a chunk of a cow femur. Now, I buy these from my local pet store. They sell packaged cow femurs, and I'll see if I can find a link to the femurs that I use. I know you can purchase them on Amazon and from other locations on the internet. So I'll see if I can find a link to one of those femur bones, and I'll put it up there. But what you want to look for is just a small section of the cow femur, and it can't be stuffed. If you're buying it from a pet store, you don't want to buy the ones that are stuffed with liver or peanut butter or anything like that. It just needs to be the bone itself. Now, the reason why I like to use these is because, like I said, they're cow femurs. And the cow femur is a leg bone in the cow. Now, because a cow is so heavy, the femur has to be really strong to support the weight of the cow. So the bone is very hard and it's very dense. So it works really well for making a bone nut. But you can also purchase femurs from a butcher shop. But you've got to be careful when you purchase them, because even though it's a femur and we know that they're hard and dense, there is a possibility for inconsistency in the bone, because this is a natural product. So you have to watch out for that. And if you're going to buy from a butcher store, you're going to have to do a lot of work to prep it. You're going to have to boil it out. You're going to have to clean it and then let it dry. Whereas when you purchase the femur from a pet store, it's good to go. You can take it home and cut it up. And out of a typical, I think they're about 6 or 7 inches in length, I can get 20 blanks for guitars. So, for a minimal investment, you're getting a lot of bone nuts. Now, you can also buy prefabbed bone nuts as well. Ones that are cut specifically for certain types of guitars with the slots and everything ready to go. But I find that it's best to make your own nut when you're building a guitar, even if it's a parts caster, because you want to make sure that the slots are cut to the right depth to give you the proper action over your frets. But you can also buy blanks, bone nut blanks, and you can buy graphite blanks, and you could also get brass and titanium and so on and so forth. But you'll have to continue through the process of shaping the material and then slotting it correctly. So as I continue through this video, I'm going to show you how I take this section of a femur that I cut and how I cut it to shape and slot it and get it finished all the way through polishing it. And the key here is to creep up on the final product. You don't want to try to cut it exactly to size right away. You want to cut it a little bit larger and then gradually sand and shape it until it achieves the right shape. Otherwise, you run the risk of going too far and ruining the nut and having to start over. But that's going to be typical for the first time you make a guitar nut. If you're lucky, you'll have success on the first try. But if not, you'll have to make another one and continue until you get it right. That's one of the reasons why I like to buy those femurs from the pet store, because I can cut it up, and like I said, I'll have 20 blanks that I can reach for if I make a mistake and have to start over again. If you buy just one blank on the internet, from eBay or Amazon or whatever, if you make a mistake, you got to order another one, and that just causes delays. So let's head out to the shop and start fabricating this nut. As you can see, the chunk of bone that I'm going to be using is much too large. So I'm going to have to cut it down to its final dimensions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by marking the width of where the nut is going to be resting on. There's a shelf here that the nut will sit on. And when I cut this, I'm going to cut it a bit larger than what it's actually going to need to be, because then what I'll do is I will gradually sand it to its final dimension. Now, whenever you're working with bone, you should always wear a dust mask, because the dust that's produced is nasty stuff and you don't want to be breathing this into your lungs. And if you're not wearing glasses, you should have a safety glasses to wear to protect your eyes from any of the flakes and stuff that can come off as you're cutting and sanding the bone. Okay, so now you can see that I have it cut to a width that is slightly larger than it needs to be. But what I need to do now is I need to flatten this surface. And this surface is what's going to sit on the shelf on the neck in front of the end of the fretboard. And I want to get that nice and flat before I continue on with additional carving and sanding. Now, the real art of making a guitar nut is that it involves a lot of trial fitting as you gradually creep up on the final shape. And it's also important to make sure that the shelf that the nut is going to sit on is shaped correctly and it doesn't have any glue squeeze out or anything like that that could impede the fit of the nut. And usually to do this, I'll use a very sharp chisel as well as my Japanese Iwasaka files. Okay, so I've got a good initial fit, and I think I'm going to mark the front of the nut with an X for now, so that I know that's how this nut will sit on here, because I don't want to accidentally flip it upside down or flip it backwards or anything like that. So I know that this way seems to fit the best. Now what I can do is I can begin tackling this edge here. And this is going to be a bit of a challenge here to get that angle just right. Okay, it's getting close, but it's still quite a bit oversized. So I just need to take a little bit more off each end. Okay, I'm really close here, but I'm going to leave it for now. And what I need to do next is determine the height of the nut. And to do that, I'm going to be using, it's a special pencil. It's actually just a regular pencil, but I took it to my belt sander and I ground it in half. So it's got this flat surface. And I'm going to place that flat surface on top of the frets. And then I'm going to move the pencil across the width of the fretboard all the way to the other side. And what I get is a line, and that line actually represents the lowest I can go. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove this top portion of this material, and I'm going to get it down close to that line, but I'm still going to leave at least 1/16 of an inch above that line, so that I can gradually sand it down to its final dimensions later on. Okay, so I've got the basic dimensions of the nut formed. So I have the width and the top, which includes the radius that matches the radius of the frets, and the thickness. So what I need to do now is I need to continue refining the shape by gradually sanding it. And I'll do some of the sanding with my belt sander, but I'm going to switch and start doing some of the sanding by hand, and that way I won't accidentally go too far, because a belt sander removes a lot of material very quickly, so I need to be careful at this stage. Now, when I do the hand sanding, I'll typically use like a 220 grit sandpaper, and I'll place it on a flat surface like the platen on my oscillating spindle sander. And then I can sand to get the final angles and shapes and dimensions of the nut. And it's really just about constantly checking the fit and then doing a little bit of additional sanding in order to get everything to fit so that there are no gaps and it sits, most importantly, so that the face of the nut is flush against the end of the fretboard. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I want to round over this edge because I want the strings to, once they cross over the top of the nut, they're going to angle down to the tuners. And I don't really need to have all this material on the front top edge of the nut, so I can round it over. That way the strings will only be in contact with the nut right at the face of the nut where the strings leave the nut slot and head towards the bridge. So this is going to get rounded over. Then what I also want to do is just to slightly knock back some of these sharp edges, because if I don't, they'll chip. Perfect fit. Now what I need to do is put the strings on and then position them so that I get the string spacing correct. Okay, so I've decided I'm going to go ahead and position the strings using my string spacing ruler instead of trying to do it visually by laying the strings over the nut when the nut is on the guitar. It was proving to be a little bit difficult to get that to work. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the string spacing ruler. Now these things are kind of complicated to understand, but what you have are a series of notches in the ruler with corresponding line marks. And they start out at this end where they're far apart, but then as you move along the length of the ruler from the left to the right, they get closer together. And the same thing on this side, it gradually gets closer together. So as you can see at this end, the notches are very close together. But you've got high notches and then you've got these lower notches. And what you're going to do is you're going to try to find either the high notches or the low notches, 6 of them, that are going to fit within the width of your nut. And you can get pretty precise with this. So what I need to do is I need to find 6 of these notches that will allow me to position the strings so that I will have adequate spacing between the string and the edge of the nut, and then I will be able to slot the nut for each of the strings in between. And what this does is it takes into account the fact that your strings go from a thin high E to a thick wound low E. So it compensates for that thickness. So as I'm looking here, you know, if I'm way down at this end and I pick, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you look, you'll notice that the 6th string would be right at the very edge. The next string and each subsequent string would be positioned correctly, but then when I get to that high E, it's clear to the edge. So I need to move the ruler and find position that is a little more to my liking, especially with regard to the distance between the 1st and the 6th string and the edges of the nut. And I think the one that I found that works the best is going to be this notch, this lower notch, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. And I can position those so that the notch for the high E is about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters in from that edge. And then the same thing with the low E, the 6th string. It's about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters in from that edge. So once I have that position and I've selected the notches that I want to use, I'll just put a small tick mark for each one of those strings. And these will indicate where I need to make the slots for each string. Okay, so I've got those marked. Now what I need to do is I'm going to cut a very shallow starter slot so that I can position the strings and check my spacing to make sure I like how it's looking. Now I've got the strings already on the guitar, but I've moved them off to the side, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to put a shallow notch for each of the strings, and I'm using a 13,000th nut slotting file. And then I can check that spacing to see if I feel like that's correct. And it sure looks like it's pretty good. So what I can do now is I can start to make those slots deeper using the correct gauge nut slotting file for each string. When I slot a nut, I follow just some basic rules of thumb, and these are my own rules of thumb, but I think they're probably shared by a lot of other luthiers as well. But what I'm doing is I'm using my nut slotting files to cut the slot into the nut, and I'm basically enlarging that smaller tick mark that I made earlier to position the strings. And as I cut the slot with the file, what I'm doing is I'm cutting the slot so that it is almost perfectly horizontal with the fretboard. And I'll continue to file with my nut slotting file, periodically reinserting the string into the slot and checking the distance over the first fret. And there's a couple of ways that I can do that. One is I can use a feeler gauge to measure that distance between the top of the fret and the bottom of the string. And what I shoot for is about 10,000ths of an inch on the plain strings. And then I'll bump it up to about 20,000ths of an inch for the wound strings. So I'll continue to check that. The other way that you can check is to press the string down to the second fret and then check to see if it's touching the first fret. And you want basically about the thickness of a human hair between the top of that first fret and the bottom of the string when you press the string down to the second fret. That's just a quick way to do it. But then you can also check it with feeler gauges. In fact, this first slot that I'm cutting is for a 10,000ths diameter string. So I'm using a 10,000ths thick nut slotting file. So I can actually slide that under to see if I'm getting close to that amount of clearance, which it's pretty close to it. But then once I have the depth of the slot cut, the next thing I want to do is I want to create fall off in the bottom of the slot as it is approaching the tuners. So to understand that, I've created an illustration which shows the string entering the nut from, this is a side view cross-sectional. And you can see how the string contacts the nut at the face, and then it bends down towards the tuners. And I create fall off at the bottom of the slot because what I'm trying to do is minimize the amount of contact between the slot and the string. Because by minimizing the contact, you can improve the sustain and the tone of the guitar. If you've ever had a guitar where a string will have a sitar-like sound to it when you pluck the string, that's almost always because the string is contacting too much of the nut slot as the string passes through the nut. So by creating some fall off, we have contact occurring only at the very front of the nut. And it's sort of like stretching the string between two razor blades, one at each end of the scale. When you pluck the string, you will get maximum sustain. The string will vibrate the longest. But if you were to replace the razor blade with a block of metal on each end with a flat surface, because of that increased amount of contact, you're muting the sustain. So you want to minimize the amount of contact between the string and the nut. But you have to be careful here, because if you make that contact too sharp, the nut slot is going to wear faster, and pretty soon the string is going to be lower in the slot because it's worn away that contact patch. And then the string will end up contacting that first fret. So the way I form this is I take my nut slotting file and I angle it down towards the tuners to create that fall off. Now, another thing I like to do as I'm slotting is I like to hold the file at an angle like you see here, and then gradually, as I'm filing, raise the file up until it is vertical. And what that does is it ever so slightly widens the slot so that the slot isn't going to be contacting the string along the sides of the string as it passes through the nut. Because again, we want to minimize that contact. Think of the contact as being sort of like muting the string with your palm. The more material that's in contact with the string, the more it's going to deaden sustain. That's why I always kind of laugh at guys with really fat fingers who complain that their guitars don't have any sustain. And that's usually because their fingers are muting some of that sustain when they press the strings down to the frets. So I'll create that fall off. And one way to tell, like I said, that you've got too much contact is when you pluck the string. That sounds pretty clean. But if there was too much contact, it would ring out like the sound of a sitar. And you can tell that difference. And when that happens, you know you've got to continue to remove material in order to minimize contact. Now that slot's perfect. So now what I have to do is just work my way along the nut here and continue slotting. And for the next one, the string is 13 thousandths of an inch, so I'm using a 13 thousandths of an inch file, and I'll use that to cut the slots. Now there are going to be occasions where you may not have a file that perfectly matches the diameter of the string. And if that's the case, you have to just find a file that is maybe slightly larger and then use that. If not, you can use a file that's slightly smaller. You just got to make sure that as you carve it, you're angling that file to widen the slot so that the string won't bind up or stick when you try to install it into the slot. Here's an example of where I don't have a file that matches the size of the string. This is a 17 thousandths diameter string, but I only have a 16 thousandths thick file. So I'm just going to use that, and I will angle the file as I'm cutting to make it the slot wider to accommodate the string. Now, another way that you can check to make sure you got some fall off going on is you can press down the string on the tuner side of the nut, and you'll see the string move up and down in the slot. And you can tell if it wasn't moving here, then there would be no fall off. Now, on the wound strings, I try to keep the slot so that it's only about half as deep as the diameter of the string. That again helps to minimize the amount of contact between the string and the nut. But sometimes that's not possible because at this stage, the height of the nut still may be a bit tall. So later on, after I finish slotting the nut, I'll sand the top so that I get half the string, half the wound strings above the surface of the nut. That's not as important with the plain strings because they're more likely to pop out of the slot if the slot was only half as deep as the diameter of the string, because these strings, the diameter is so small. But with the wound strings, you can get away with doing that. Now, the last thing I need to do is I need to finish sand the nut because I want it to look nice. So typically what that means, I'll sand with 400, 600, and then probably 800 grit sandpaper. And you can go further if you want to. Heck, you can even take it to a buffing machine and buff it up to a really nice shiny surface. It just depends on how far you want to take it. But I'll sand all the surfaces of the nut except for the bottom. I do not want to sand the bottom because if I do that, I would be essentially lowering the slots, and I run the risk of the strings coming into contact with that first fret and thereby ruining the nut. So I won't sand the bottom, just the front, the back, the top, and the sides, and I'll get them looking all nice and pretty. And then to install the nut, I'm just going to take a little bit of wood glue on a toothpick and just place it on that shelf, as well as the front of the fretboard. Doesn't require a lot of glue, but I just want it to hold the nut in place. And if the nut ever needs to be removed, all you have to do is apply a little bit of heat to the nut, and that'll break the bond of the glue. And I'll just hold it in place here for a few to get it to set up. then I will use the strings themselves to clamp it down. There, now I'll just let that sit for a couple of hours, let it dry, and then I'll come back with a really sharp chisel and slice out some of the squeeze out. All right, guys, well, mission accomplished. The nut is finished. So the next step in the process is going to be to solder in the electronics. And I plan to do that in the next episode. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if so, please give it a thumbs up. It's a great way to show support for my channel, and it doesn't cost you anything to do so. So click that thumbs up button right now. And if you'd like to take your support to the next level, you can visit eguitarplants.com or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below for both. And there you can purchase guitar plants, the tools that we use to make guitars, as well as some cool t-shirts, a coffee mug, and a hoodie. So anything that you purchase there is going to help to support this channel so I can keep building guitars and making videos where I can share my knowledge and experiences with all of you. And if you'd like to support the channel, but want to keep it simple, you can just click that thanks button down below and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. So until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for more guitar building videos.